Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a really long time since I uploaded anything. I was really busy. I got my PhD, I started a lectureship, just been busy with work really. So given what is going on in the world at the moment, I thought it'd be really kind of appropriate to kind of go through an article that is about a wealth tax. So we're hearing a lot of noise at the moment with the Labour government kind of having they're struggling because they did make this kind of pledge that they wouldn't raise taxes, but they're kind of really in need of increasing their revenue sources. So I can't see a way that they're going to be able to do that without raising taxes. And it's kind of re-brought up this argument about whether or not there should exist a wealth tax in the UK, and would it be feasible, how would it work, and so on and so forth. And there's an article posted in The Guardian about that. So I thought that we would go through it and be a bit critical. But then also we could kind of talk a little bit more about a wealth tax and what is said about it and what are some problems that could occur and actually, why maybe it might be a good idea. Now, anything to do with taxes kind of gets people riled up a little bit because I think people don't like this idea that we are taking money away from people that have worked really, really hard. As you'll see kind of from what the proposals for a wealth tax would be, is it's not coming from people that are working really, really, really hard. It's people that can kind of earn this money passively because they just have so much wealth. It's not the people that are out there kind of, really working however many hours a day and they're earning a lot of income via that, and then we're just saying, oh, you know what, let's take that from you. That is not the case. These are the people that are basically earning passive income. And I think that point gets forgotten quite a bit. I think people just think, oh, they're going to come and tax me. Now, it might be that the taxes that get proposed by Labour, because I highly doubt it's going to be a wealth tax, that, it will unfortunately be something that's going to tax hardworking individuals. But that's kind of a different point. So let's have a look at this article and let's go through it and let's kind of get a bit of a better understanding about what a wealth tax is. This is the article that we're going to go through that's on The Guardian. I have already made comments, but obviously I'm going to talk you through it as we go along. So it's quite clearly about a wealth tax and it's talking about whether or not it would work in the UK. So the first things that kind of come to my mind as soon as I read that is, well, what is the goal of this wealth tax? Is it, and kind of I suspect it is the case, would it be to reduce inequality because we have this wealth inequality that is massively surging in the UK? So if that is kind of the case and we are taxing kind of the right people, then it potentially could go some way to reducing inequality. But if it's something else, if it's just the case of raising revenue for the government, but not with the goal of reducing inequality, then it's not whether the case of would it work, I suppose. But I suppose you could ask whether it's probably the easiest way for them to raise revenue. So as you can see here, the next bit says, well, one of the problems is that it would be costly to administer. So, well, why is this? And I'm already thinking something along the lines of maybe it's a little bit difficult to value wealth. Maybe you're kind of relying on people to self-declare honestly, and maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe people are going to try and avoid this. People are trying to avoid taxes all the time, so maybe that's the case with this. But particularly I'm thinking it's probably due to valuing it and coming up with a way that you can do that and how easy that would be. But also then that poses the question to me is, well, do you need to do a one-off valuation if this is a one-off wealth tax, or if this is going to be a regular thing, are we doing regular valuations? Because if it's regular, then okay, it's much more costly, but if it's a one-off wealth tax, then obviously it's not going to be too hard. And it also depends where you set the wealth threshold, because if you set the wealth threshold really, really, really high, we're going to be talking such a small number of individuals here. So actually you're not trying to value too many people. But again, we'll find out more when we read more of the article. And then this is like the common one. This isn't just with wealth tax. This is to do with taxes in general. People are saying, well, it would drive the rich away. And I'm a little bit sceptical of this. I always have been. Well, if they're just here for tax purposes, there are places they could go that are better tax havens. So there must be something in the UK that is attracting them other than tax. So I'm, again, a little bit sceptical of that, but we'll read on. Okay, so it then, it kind of very succinctly tells you what a wealth tax is. It says it's the annual levy on an individual's total net assets. So here, this article is quite clearly going on about something that's going to be continuous. It's going to be an annual thing rather than a one-off wealth tax. And that's quite interesting because actually I think an annual one or a one-off one are two very different things, and it's important to kind of consider both of them. And we can already see that in the UK, there are already some taxes on wealth. So this is interesting. If there are already some taxes on wealth, why is it that they're not effective enough? Because if they were fully effective or effective enough, we wouldn't be bringing up this idea of introducing yet another wealth tax. Okay, so, and they give a few examples. They give inheritance tax, they give capital gains tax, and they give council tax. So I sat and thought to myself about these three things, and why is it maybe these are particularly flawed in the UK? So the first one is inheritance tax. Well, the super rich have and always have done, they're able to find loopholes, or they have the money to exploit loopholes to get away from inheritance tax. So something along the lines of a trust, or there is something called a pension wealth exemption. And it's because you don't get inheritance tax on pension wealth. And I then looked on a website which is kind of like a fact website. I might link it in the description box because it's interesting to look at. I just can't, the names escaped me right now. And we can see that roughly 1.7 billion is lost due to the exploitation of loopholes when it comes to inheritance tax. So that's a really large source of revenue here, and it shows that this kind of already existing wealth tax in terms of inheritance tax just isn't effective. Then there's the capital gains tax. So again, this is exploited because you can get something called business asset disposal relief. Basically, it's quite easy to pay a lower rate of capital gains if you're trying to sell a business as opposed to selling, like, I don't know, your home. And again, this is something that the rich are very kind of in tune with, and they're able to exploit. And again, the same website that I mentioned earlier estimates around 1.16 billion per year is lost by this loophole. And then there's council tax, and this is interesting. So you probably the one you're most familiar with is council tax, because you most likely to have come across that already, and it's to do with the value of your home. So I can see why you think it's wealthy. Yeah, it's to reduce wealth, because if you own or if you live in a home that's of a greater value, then you would technically be classed as wealthier, and therefore you pay greater council tax. But there's so many problems with this. So one person could own a really, really expensive home and rent it out. Well, the person that is renting it off of them is the people that have to pay the council tax, not the people that own it. And I think there's a very big difference between having wealth that you own and essentially having kind of like an income that you can afford to rent on that property. So it ignores the idea of, do you own it outright, or even do you have a really big mortgage? Because if you take out a really big mortgage on a property, okay, look, to get that mortgage, you obviously have quite a good income. But at that point in time, your wealth isn't that great because it's an asset that you don't fully own. You've got a massive mortgage on it. Actually, it's much more the bank's than it is yours. Yet you're paying this council tax. Renters pay this too, which I've just said. And then another big, big flaw is that it's based on the valuation of the house in 1991. We quite clearly need to update this, okay, because properties have massively changed, their value have changed, but we're basing it on a 1991 value. Okay, so that's kind of just my initial thoughts of this. So then we are kind of getting into a bit more of the meat of what this wealth tax would be aimed at, because I think a lot of people think incorrectly we're just trying to say, let's introduce another tax on hardworking individuals. Well, that's not the case. What we're trying to say here is it's only going to be aimed at the ultra rich. So this is people with assets of over £10 million, okay? So quite clearly here, we're trying to say that we're taxing wealth, not work. There's an economist that really preaches this called Gary Stevenson. Okay, he's a bit divisive in kind of what people think. I personally quite like him, and if you want to look into more of this, maybe you should go into looking into him. But this is kind of this, look, the income from these people, by the time you've got assets worth over £10 million, you're going to be getting passive income from them at a rate that people that, even if I was to work 24 hours in a day, which obviously wouldn't be sustainable, I just wouldn't be able to make the amount of money that they can make, and they're not having to work. It's just passive. Okay, so that's really, really important here. It is just for the ultra rich. And again, this is going to be such a small amount of people in terms of absolute numbers that have assets over £10 million. Okay, and then they've come on to saying like, well, if we could raise the revenue from this, it could raise a lot. Like, so here it's saying could raise about $2.1 trillion. Obviously, this is into dollars and looking into to the UK, but there are, there's things that definitely need reforming and need funds for that. So the NHS, education, and climate, for example. Okay, why is this important now? Why is this blowing up more now? And it isn't just the case of because of the situation we've got. It's because actually we've seen a massive increase in the number of billionaires that are in the UK. So it says here in the 1990 we had 15 UK billionaires, but now that we have 171. And the problem here is all to do with kind of inequality, wealth inequality. We're going to see massive differences in wealth inequality, and that typically isn't good for an economy. Okay, so then we start to go on, and they're saying that, well, a wealth tax would be the fair way of redistributing a small proportion of that money to help those most in need. But something I missed out here that I wrote a little note to myself is why is it important that we're talking about people with like really, really high assets? Because obviously you could introduce it for also people lower down, but here assets, revenue, and really, really importantly, the behavioural response is likely to be very, very different from these ultra rich to people that are just working really hard. So if you're ultra rich and this tax comes in, it may be the case that your behavioural response isn't going to be you're not going to do anything about it. But if this would be if this would really be would affect you because you've set the wealth threshold at quite low, but you're working really hard to make that wealth, the worry would be that we would disincentivize people to work, and we don't really want that. Whereas because these people are earning their income passively, it's unlikely that you're disincentivizing people to work, and that's kind of why I put that there. And it was just kind of like a thought. Okay, and again, it's got support because things need support. So it's saying that 3/4 of Britons were found to back a 2% tax on wealth over £10 million. So this is good. We got the support here, although it needs support of the people in government as opposed to just the general public. Okay, so then the cons, which is the important part here, because obviously, well, it hasn't come in, and you could argue it's all kind of political reasons and protecting friends and so on and so forth, but there are more to it than just that. So there's this complication of, well, firstly, enforcement. Like, if you bring this in, how are we going to enforce people to pay it? And also there's kind of administrative costs, and it is this idea of just valuing wealth, okay, that could be particularly hard. If you've got something that wouldn't be up for sale, how do you ascertain what it would likely sell for? Okay, but that's not impossible. We can do it. Okay, so it might be hard, but it's not impossible. And again, we're talking about a really small number of people here. Small in terms of if you take the whole entire population, not just small in terms of what you think is a small number. Again, there's this worry that we're just going to lose these people. They're just going to leave, and they're going to take their money with them, and like sell their assets and take their money with them, and then we're going to have this like exodus from the UK. But again, and I said this earlier on, there must be something other than the low tax that makes the UK attractive, because otherwise they would have gone to tax havens already. And then there's actually evidence that goes against this, which is interesting. So obviously when they've looked into this, it was saying that 9,500 millionaires have been claimed have left the UK in 2024. And that sounds like a lot, but it actually represented a really, really small proportion of the amount of UK's millionaires. And this is with people with assets more than 1 million, okay? So even in this instance here, we found such a small proportion leaving. And I suspect it will be the same, especially, by the time you've got that much wealth, is this really having that much an impact? You notice it that much? And then again, maybe they say they would, because people like to protect what they've got. Okay, so again, but let's delve into that. So there's this fear that some ultra wealthy individuals will leave the country, and it's not entirely unfounded. So I'm willing to say, I mean, I don't think it is a big fear, but let's pretend it is. Let's pretend that premise is true. okay, how can we get around that then? Is there a way we can implement such a wealth tax a bit like this and not have this fear? And this is where I'm saying there's a big difference between it being an annual thing and a one-off thing. Obviously, if it's going to be a complete one-off wealth tax, it needs to be credible. So, and it also needs to be believable. You need to be able to make it out that you're doing it and it's only going to be a one-off. It's not going to be every year. It could be something along the lines of it comes into effect as you announce it. So you haven't given people warning, because if you give people warning and you're really insistent that they're going to leave, then they would obviously work things out so that they can leave. But if you can do it in such a way that they don't have much warning, then it's unlikely for them to leave. But it needs to be that they believe you that it's going to be a one-off thing. Because if you do this and you make a nice amount of revenue from it, what's stopping you? Because obviously new parties can come in and just overrule things. What's stopping you from just doing it again another year? And in which case, if they suspect that's going to happen and this threat that they're going to leave is credible, then from that one time you would have got revenue from them, but then they will leave for later on. A credible one-off wealth tax, one of the benefits of it is that it is taxing the existing holdings rather than this idea that will also come for any future accumulation of wealth, which again might be one of the reasons that forces people to leave. And when you do it on just existing holdings rather than this idea that we're going to tax future accumulation, this would be the case if it's a one-off wealth tax, you don't really distort behaviour such as like income tax does, because income tax, you know that it distorts things into the future and you kind of get a better idea about how income tax is going to change. Obviously, there's the idea about, is it fair? I think that's a thing that we do need to think about. And I think when we start thinking about taxes in general, especially wealth tax, and we start to think about, is it fair? We start to think about, well, how have they got their wealth in the first place? If they got their wealth by not doing anything and it's purely kind of all inherited, well, is that entirely fair? It's not like you've worked hard. Is it that they've managed to get all their wealth via some exploitative scheme that should retrospectively now be taxed? In which case, more people think that's fair. They tend to have less idea of it being fair if it's down to kind of what we call hard work. Well, these are huge figures here that we're talking about for the wealth. It's unlikely just to be down to hard work. And then when I was looking into this further, I found that HMRC does not have records on the value of individual properties. And why is this important? Well, because kind of a comeback to this is we don't really need this new wealth tax. We just need to reform what we've already got. And part of the one people think we should reform is council tax. And yeah, I agree, you know, there are definitely big flaws with council tax, but if we don't have records of the value of individual properties, this would make reforming council tax incredibly hard. But also, this would involve the population, every single property. That's a lot more work than it is in trying to value this small group of people and their wealth. Again, going back to this, with a one-off wealth, you only need to expend time and effort and resources valuing everything once. Whereas if it's a kind of an ongoing thing every year, then you would need to expend that every single year. But even if it's a one-off thing, just by the way, you could do it in such a way that it gets paid over a certain amount of years. You don't pay it all in one year, and in which case it brings in the government revenue over a certain amount of years. It doesn't just have to be in one whole year. So it's still a credible one-off wealth tax, but it gets paid over a certain amount of years. So these are kind of just my thoughts about wealth tax, kind of what's wrong with things at the moment, and how this could be how this could be implemented, and just some things that we need to think about. I just don't think that saying that the valuation is a big enough con. Maybe it's something that we do need to start to implement in a better system so that we can have a better idea of people's wealth.